All right, everybody, what's going on? How y'all doing? Welcome to today's edition of SWAC Talk, the show we cover the SWAC inside and out. Of course, I'm your tour guide around the SWAC Seawells coming at you. And we are gonna today do we're gonna give out some grades for coaching. We did this on SWAC Smoke a couple weeks ago. Well, it might have been a month ago now, but we kind of ran through everybody and kind of gave them grades. But I wanted to kind of go down the list and um do it myself. Um because there's been some more changes since we did that list, and some things have happened up and down in both directions. So I wanted to kind of with school being out now for most people, people that got their report cards are getting them. Hey, let's give coaches some report cards. So this is our SWAC Talk 2024 final coaching grades of the season, and like I said, I'm gonna explain why I put everybody in whatever tier they're in, because it's A through F, just like school. So if you don't pass, you don't pass. But we'll start off with the top tier, and that's our A tier, and there's only one guy on that tier, and it's pretty easy, and that's Coach TC Taylor from Jackson State. Obviously, 8-0 regular season SWAC record, SWAC championship celebration bowl victory, 12-2 overall record. Honestly, if it wasn't for that game against Grambling where they turned the ball over 5 times and gave up like two defensive touchdowns, you're looking at a team that's 11-1. And honestly, they weren't that far out against ULM. ULM was able to have some success running the ball against them late in the game, but that was a tight game in the early second half. So, this could have been a 14-0 record. It's not that big of a stretch. Um, but coming from taking over the team last year, having to basically build that team up, and continuing to lay the foundation to run through the conference and have basically the best units on both sides of the ball in the conference. Um, you don't get much better than that. And winning the championship doesn't automatically put you in this tier, because if somebody else win the championship, they probably wouldn't be in this spot. But it's not much to nitpick on this team, on him. I mean, they had some early, some games early in the season where they kind of let their foot off the gas, but after a while, I think it was like the last eight or team, they were just not allowing teams to have any success after halftime. And that's the mark of great coaching staff. He put together a good staff. The guys believe in the coaches. The coaches believe in the players. They bought in. They made a South Carolina State team that a lot of us thought would come in there and give JSU a good run. They made that team look average. And like I said, so they have done the job. They didn't falter. They carried the weight of every week. They took every punch. And it's honestly not much you can nitpick. And even to throw a little bit more on there, this team battled some injuries early. They lost some guys who they had been counting on, who were anticipated to be top guys. A guy like Fabian McCray, who was an all conference preseason guy, did not play, injuries and everything. So, started off without Irv Mulligan, got him back. They lost some guys during the season. They went through adversity, but never faltered. And a lot of that is because of the coaching staff. And so, you have to reward, in terms of this, you have to reward the team and coach for the job that they've done. I mean, they finished on a 10-game winning streak. You can't, it don't get that much better than that. So, that was an easy position to put a guy in the A tier. That's probably one of the easiest ones that I have on this list. The F group is kind of easy too, but the A tier is reserved for a guy who was top notch, and he coach of the year. So, he earned that, and so he is the only guy in the A tier. Now the B tier has two coaches in it, and they're there for honestly different reasons. They got to where they are in different ways, and like I said, and for different reasons. We'll start with the first guy on my A tier, and that's Eddie Robinson from Alabama State. Now you look at their record. Yes, they were 7-5, 5-3 in conference, but this is a team that after the first week of the season was without their first and second string quarterback. They played every game from week 2 to the end of the season with either their third, fourth, or fifth string quarterback. They played the last few weeks of the season with a guy who didn't even come there as a quarterback, and they were able to be in the SWAC race until the very end. Like I say, if it wasn't for an upset loss to Grambling and a loss to Jackson State, this is a team that could have went to the SWAC championship game, and that's what an offense that just wasn't there, for a good stretch of the season. Now they had a nice little stretch in the middle of that, the Valley, Alabama State, those couple of weeks. They really looked sharp throwing the ball. Um, Bethune, they also was solid. Offensively, they were pretty solid there. FAMU, they were up and down. And Alcorn, they were, kind of in the mix there. But they, after losing your starting quarterback and your top guy behind him, to basically go 7-4 is not bad. I mean, of course, you're weighted and enhanced by a top defense, that arguably the number one defense in the conference, and they had to pull a lot of weight this season because of the offense kind of being hit or miss, and so having that and having some young guys step up in the running back position, kind of doing some things to make the team right. They made some early moves in the season before the season on the offensive staff, and some of those things helped them out this season. So, I think what he went through and his team went through. I thought he did a solid job of getting those guys ready and keeping them focused when they could have packed it in, when they got that deep into their depth chart at the quarterback position. Most teams, they get that far down, it's over because they don't really have a lot of guys that can make things happen, and they had to, do it on the fly. So I think just that alone puts them there. Like I said, the record, they finished second in the division, where they finished tied for second in the division. And 75 is not an outstanding record. It's basically what they finished last season, but they continue to be in the hunt for the division. This season, a lot of adversity held them back, but they didn't quit because of that. So I think that is the main reason why he's there. Plus, they have a great defense, so that's why he's in the B tier. The other coach that I had in the B tier, and you can fluctuate between B and C, and I wait a little bit of his grade on the success of the team, I guess you could say. And that's Terrence Graves from Southern. I put him in the B tier because this was a team that started off the season really, really rocky. You lost to McNeese. You didn't look great against Savannah State. You lost to Jackson State. You found a way to beat Prairie View in overtime, which is going to be kind of a running theme. And then you got blown out by Nichols. So you're sitting basically in the early stretches of October. You're sitting at 2-3 with one FCS win. And from then on, you basically beat Texas Southern Alcorn. You lost to FAMU. Then you won your last 4 games to close out the regular season. So from October 12th to the end of the regular season, you won. You went 6-1, which is tremendous. Which is tremendous. I mean, for a team that did not have a solid quarterback pretty much all season in terms of a guy that you can just trust to put out there. An offense that was really not good running the ball early in the season. By the end of the season, you kind of became a team that at least was a threat to run the ball. You finished 5th in the league in rushing when the early portion of the season you were 10, 11. So, I think that side of the ball never really was spectacular, but found a way to win games. And, you can say, they got lucky. You can say they snuck by some teams, and all of that, can be taken into account. But the defense kept the team on track. You led the league in passing defense. And this is even with a defense that didn't really force a ton of turnovers. They just never quit. And I think that's a mark of a coach and his program. Now, is that sustainable? Probably not. But this is a one year ranking, and they won the division at 7-1. They won it by 2 games. They actually basically won the division by November 9th. They officially won it on the 16th, but they basically were in position to win it by basically by November, the beginning of November. So they did everything that you want a team to do. Now they didn't do it pretty, and that's where grades can be up and down. But they finished the regular season on a 4-game winning streak. They did lose to Jackson State um in a manner that the game got away from them in the second half. JSU dominated the second half, but all in all, with this team being in position to lose games. They you can say TSU botched the punt, but Southern still had to score to put the game in overtime, and then they still had to score in overtime and play defense to win. Bethune-Cookman, same thing. Trail 3-0, basically whole stretch of the game. 1 and 5 overtimes because they made the play that they needed to make. Same thing with Prairie View. They finally started to kind of put some things together toward the end of the season and won a couple games. Not in comfortable fashion, but at least not in overtime. So that's why I put him in the B tier. I mean, you can, if you were to say he still did a C job, I think that would be fair. But I think, winning the division and basically, finding ways to win, no matter how pretty or ugly, I think he gets credit for that. Honestly, any coach who did that and got his team to a division, I would probably put them in the same spot. Um, Early season, very rocky, not pretty at all, but was able to survive that and get him and his team to a division championship in his first year. So I give him credit for that there. The C tier is a mixed bag of guys. It's a guy who I had high expectations for. It's a guy, it's 2 coaches I basically had high expectations for, and then one guy who, excuse me, exceeded expectations. And starting with the guy that exceeded expectations, that would be Chris Dishman from Texas Southern. I thought this team would win like 2 games at best. They finished the season at 5-6, 4-4 in conference, so they finished third. They finished alone in third place. They were picked last in the division by the media, as well as me. They did not have a lot of expectations coming into the season, and they didn't necessarily have the greatest season. It was rocky, but they were able to. First off, they were able to beat Prairie View to open up their season, which is a big win for them. They kind of faltered a little bit after that, losing 3 straight. Then they won one, then they lost one, then they won one, then they lost 2, then they closed out the season with a 2-game winning streak. So they were kind of up and down. They didn't necessarily beat. They didn't necessarily beat anybody that you would say is better than them. With the exception of maybe Prairie View, that's up and down depending on how you looked at the team then and the team now. But they won games that maybe they dropped or predicted to have dropped in the early portion of the season, and they did it with an offense that I was honestly not a fan of. They didn't really have a tremendous offense. They only scored 21 points a game. They were last in total offense at 265 yards per game. They did run the ball pretty well at 147 yards per game, and the passing attack was last at 117 yards per game. They only threw 8 touchdowns on the season, which was the second fewest, only ahead of another team who I got in my C tier. So with that being said, offensively they just did not do a lot, but they found a way to win. The defense, I always said the defense was kind of underrated, 5th in passing defense. They were 9th in rushing defense. They were 6th in total defense, and they finished the season 8th in scoring defense. So the defense actually was not that bad. They were more middle of the pack, but they did a lot in the running game, did a lot in spurts. And, to go from, maybe look at, like you sitting at the beginning of October, not knowing how many wins you were going to get. You had a 28-10 victory over Virginia Lynchburg, and then you lost a game to Southern that you should have won. There's no reason why you shouldn't have won that game, but then you turn around and you beat Grambling. You lose the FAMU, and then you lose the Alcorn, but then you beat Bethune-Cookman and Pine Bluff to close the season. And neither one of those games are gimmies. Last season, Pine Bluff came from behind and beat them, so they did what they needed to do, and I think that is as solid of a job of a first year coach as you can get, especially with a program that did not have any expectations from outside of the locker room and the core fans. So that's why I have him in the C tier. The next two guys, they in the C tier for different reasons than Dishman. They're both here for kind of disappointing reasons. We'll start with FAMU and Coach Cozy. They finished 5-3, 7-5 overall. They had they never really established themselves as the FAMU that a lot of us expected. Of course, there was gonna be some fluctuations and changes, with a new coach and some new guys because you lost some key guys from last season. But I think the defense took a while to really start to get any kind of footing, and that hurt them earlier. But it didn't necessarily hurt them on the scoreboard. They basically won all the games early in the season that they were supposed to. They won their first two games against Norfolk State and South Carolina State. Then they lost the two FBS games to Miami and Troy. Then they beat Alabama State, which which regardless is still a big victory on the road. So they're 3-2 before they dropped the game to Jackson State, which was a tight game at the half. And JSU scored, I think, 15 in the fourth quarter to win that game. Then they would rebound from that loss to beat Southern and Texas Southern. And then the wheels kind of fell off for a bit. And this is probably this 2-game stretch is mainly the reason why I put them in the C tier. Because if they win these 2 games, he still probably gets a B for the job. But losing to Prairie View and Valley in back-to-back weeks, including one of them at home, snapping a 23-game winning streak at home to a team that hadn't won a road game against an FCS opponent in quite some time. Those are 2 very disappointing losses. The back was against the wall, and they rebounded against Alabama, A&M, and Bethune-Cookman. But those 2 games there really shaped the narrative of this season, and it really changed the trajectory and the identity of where this team was. I think a lot of leeway was given in some of the early games because they still found ways to win games. They looked like they were turning the corner against Texas Southern, and I really expected them to kind of springboard from that game to the end of the season, with 4 very winnable games, and you went 2-2 in that stretch, which is very disappointing for a team who was picked by me to win the division, and ultimately they came up short there, and that really hurts. Like I said, just not really being where you expected this team to be. Offensively, they passed the ball extremely well. Was second in the league in passing. The rushing attack actually ended up finishing 7th, and that's because they had 2 really big games at the end of the season running the ball that boosted them because they made offensive coordinator change in before their last 2 games, and they put a better emphasis on running the ball, which I thought they should have done all season. I mean, they didn't get their first rushing touchdown until the middle portion of the season. So they just did not run the ball. It was not through the fault of the guys on the field. It was because they chose not to run the ball with their system. And they had the fewest rushing attempts of anybody in the conference. So they just did not run the ball at all. But once they did, the running game kicked up, and they still finished 3rd in total offense. So they weren't necessarily bad. They were disappointing by the standards that FAMU has set the last couple of years. And so that's why I feel like those 2 losses is what puts them in this C spot, even with the up and down defense all season and, not necessarily having blow away games. I still thought you make it through the schedule unscathed, other than Jackson State. You probably still a solid B job because if you won those two games that you lost, you finish at 9-3, and you finish 7-1 in conference. So that's a big difference, you know, because then your only losses were to teams who were A, better than you in the conference, and B, were FBS opponents. Losing those two games is highly disappointing, and they really put them in a tailspin. Now, they were able to rebound, and that's what really keeps them in the C spot, because if they lost another game, then I think you drop to a D, which is not good. But I think they rebounded, so I'm interested to see how they respond moving forward. But I think a C is pretty fair for the way the season ended. I mean, some people would really punish them even more for that, but I think that's only fair to put them there. The other team that I put in the C tier, and this is another team who I had very high expectations for coming into the season, and that's Alcorn. The Alcorn was my pick to win the West, and I stayed that way till probably late October. Even after they lost to Southern, I still kind of thought that they could finally, I thought they could kind of get their footing and still win the division. But I think this team, number one, was betrayed by their schedule, and that's one of the reasons why, even though they finished the season at 6-6 and 5-3 in conference, I still put them in a solid C spot, because I thought the two FBS games back to back, with offense that's very untested. You got new coordinator, new quarterback. You lost your key, your top rusher. You lost your top receivers. You bringing in new guys. You're trying to build this offense up, and you play against two FBS opponents, and you lose those games by a combined score of 96-3, and your offense just did not look good. And then the following week against Silver Waters, it took a second half explosion to beat them 38-7. That game was a lot similar to Southern's game against Savannah State. Both teams should have had a way better game against those opponents, but they just couldn't make it happen. And then you get blown out by McNeese. So you're coming in a SWAC play at 1-3, which is not unexpected. But the offense just did not look good. The defense was doing basically everything they could, but the offense just did not have anything yet. And then they were able to put together a couple offensive games that really showed that they were going to be a team to run the ball. They had they fell behind Pine Bluff 14-0, but they came back and won by 10, and they basically had a solid game against Valley. They had a low scoring game against Grambling, but they won it, so they were 3-0 in conference, before they lost their next two games to Southern and Alabama State, which were two very solid opponents. And then they closed out that season beating Texas Southern and Prairie View before they lost to Jackson State to close out the season. Even losing to Bama State and Southern, they were still in the mix for the division. I mean, if Southern would have dropped their game dropped a couple games in there, they may have even won the West. So they still, even with the offense kind of not really finding their way, they still basically ended up being a really solid team. I mean, 6-6 is not a great record. 5-3 is more than enough to win in the West. But offensively, their offense finished with 346 yards per game. They ran the ball extremely well, 197 yards per game. They actually had two of the top 10 rushers in the conference. Jacorian Sewell was fourth in yards per game with 67.3. Xavier Vaughn was seventh at 60.6 yards per game. So they ran the ball extremely well, and like I said, they even finished the season second in the league at 197 yards per game. At one point, they were over 200 yards per game. So they really ran the ball extremely well. Their passing attack is kind of what kept them from winning a couple of those games that they lost. They only threw the ball for 149 yards on the season, 7 touchdowns before the fewest in the league, and 12 interceptions. That's really what did them in. Defensively, they were fourth against the pass. They were eighth against the run. and they were fourth in total defense. So the defense, while not necessarily as good as what anticipated, they still were able to do enough. They led the they were fifth, sixth in the league in interceptions with 11. Actually, tied for fourth, but they were in the mix there. They forced a ton of turnovers. They led the league in fumble recoveries, so they forced 23 turnovers on the season. They just couldn't, offensively. They were a team that if they couldn't run the ball, or even if they could, they couldn't make throws when they needed to, and that kind of did them in. But the fact that they started off slow and they kind of got themselves right, and the only team they lost to in conference all finished with better overall records than them, and either equal or better conference records. Um, you can't really hold too much against them on that. They didn't lose to anybody in conference who were worse than them. So they didn't necessarily beat the teams that were better than them, but they didn't lose to the teams that were worse than them. So that's a definition of average, and a C is average. So I think there was some room for improvement, and they kind of found their way a little bit, but just not enough to overcome those early hurdles for a better overall record. And that takes us to our D tier. And again, these guys are kind of here for different reasons. I don't think any of these D guys would have been F guys because they all showed flashes. I do have one guy that I put as a D. If some things would have went different, he would have easily been in the C tier. But we'll start off with the first guy on this list, and that's Alonzo Hampton from Pine Bluff, finishing last in the division at 2-6 and 3-9 overall. You probably like that's not a D performance. That's an F performance. But they were able to kind of they were able to be competitive for the most part until late in the season. They obviously opened up their season getting shut out by Arkansas 7-0. They turned around and beat Arkansas Baptist 73-0. Then they lost to Tennessee State in a game that they had some success early, faltered late. Same thing against Central Arkansas. Started off decently early and were snowed under in the second half. Alcorn, they led that game 14-0. Before Alcorn was able to outscore them 38-14 to win this, to beat them. And so they were at 1-4, which is probably was the expected record for them at that spot. But they had shown some offensive flashes, especially in the passing game. And beating Prairie View on a Friday night helped them kind of seem like they would be a team who would not necessarily be a team to contend for the division, but a team that would be a tough out. They would turn that game into a loss the next week against Grambling, and then they would beat Valley in a hard-fought game before the wheels kind of fell off at the end of the season. They gave up 41 to Jackson State, 52 to Alabama A&M, and they gave up 31 to Southern offense that rarely crossed the high 20s. Defensively, they just were never competitive. Even they lost. They gave up 31 and a loss to TSU. They only gave up less than 20 points twice, and once was the Arkansas Baptist. The other time was to Prairie View. So they defensively, they just were just not there, and that's part of the reason why they finished where they did. Offensively, early, for that middle stretch, late October, late September, early October, their offense was one of the better offenses in the league. At one point, they were leading the league in passing. They finished third, but they just offensively they couldn't run the ball, which was a detriment to them. Running back position was thin. The defense was thin. They had to put running backs and linebacker. They just didn't have the numbers to compete in a complete season, especially on the defensive side of the ball. And that's why they were 10th in total defense, 10th in rushing defense, and they were 7th in passing defense. and they were 11th in scoring defense. So they just never really had it on defense. The one reason, the one bright spot for them was their passing game, and that was Mekhi Higgins finished second in the league in passing, 211 yards per game. He had 16 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. And of course, Giovanni Gibson is an All-American guy, HBCU All-American, FCS All-American, first team All-Conference. A guy kind of came from out of nowhere with 70 catches, 1,215 yards, and 9 touchdowns. Um, that was a stretch in the middle of the season where this kid was going over 100 yards every week. Um, and later in the season, things started going the other way, and the offense couldn't compete, couldn't keep up, and the defense never got right. And that's why I put them in the D tier instead of F tier, because I thought that even with the defensive deficiencies, the offense was solid enough to keep them competitive in games. And so they were able to kind of find their way in and out of games, but they just couldn't continue. And that's kind of like a team who's a D team. They didn't necessarily beat anybody better than them, but they didn't necessarily get blown out a lot until late in the season in conference play. The next team that we have in the D tier is Bethune-Cookman and Coach Woody. They finished 2-6 in conference as well, 2-10 overall. Their 2-10 is a little bit different because they had a couple games get away from them. Of course, they had a disappointing loss to Clark Atlanta, which should never happen. But they lost that game 38-37 on a 55-yard field goal at the end of the game. That was a game they had a 37-35 lead before a bad penalty gave Clark some more opportunities to move the ball down for the scoring, the winning score. They were trailing Bama State, but they put together a nice run and scored like 14 points in like 30 seconds or something like that, and found themselves in the mix in that game, but ultimately came up 5 points short. They got blown out by Alabama and then came back and beat Valley on the road. They lost to Jackson State in a game that was 17-17 at the half. So they were competitive there. They beat Grambling in a game that they trailed early. And then they led Southern 3-0, like I said, for like 3.5 quarters before Southern was able to score and send the game to overtime. And they lost by 2 in overtime and five overtimes. And then they closed out their season with a 17-14 loss to Texas Southern, which was a game that they had the opportunity to win or at least tie late, but it got away from them. And they would then lose to FAMU in a hard-fought game, 41-38. They led that game as well. So they had their opportunities. They never really did a lot great, but they were able to just kind of find their way in games. They made a lot of mistakes late that hurt them, penalties and things like that. They caused games to get away from them. They weren't, like I said, they weren't really great on either side of the ball, but they were competitive and they fought hard. And like I said, when you look at their defense, they were 8th in passing defense, 11th in rushing defense, 11th in total defense, and 10th in scoring defense. Offensively, they were 11th in scoring offense, 9th in total offense, 11th in passing in rushing offense, and they were 8th in total in passing offense. So, like I said, they weren't a offense or defense that would wow you, but some kind of way they found themselves in games, they just couldn't complete the deal, and that kind of is what put them in that spot. And the final guy who is in the D tier, which if things happen differently, he would be easily in the C tier, and that's Mickey Joseph from Grambling. I think a lot of his issues were on the offensive side of the ball. And they just, the defense was very opportunistic. They excelled at turnovers. And, they had two big wins that were fueled by turnovers by, I think, like a combined 11 turnovers, takeaways against Texas A&M, East Texas A&M, now Texas A&M Commerce, and Jackson State. Those games, they forced 11 total turnovers in those games, and they won. They won them both, and they were sitting at 3-1 heading into the Prairie View game. They lost that game in overtime. Then they dropped the game to Alcorn, and that's when they kind of started to falter a little bit. They had a 31 point outing against Pine Bluff the next week, and then after that, their highest point total would be 24 points against Bama State. Um, 14 against Southern, 17 against Alabama A&M, 21 against Bethune, 17 against Texas Southern. So the offense just never really got going, and I thought they had potential to have a tremendous rushing attack. But they finished 10th at 111 yards per game. The passing offense never really got going. Miles Crawley, who was the preseason offensive player of the year, never was comfortable in that offense, got injured late in the season, and passing attack fell off. They finished ninth at 170 yards per game. Total offense, they were 11th at 282 yards per game. I mean, that's behind offenses like Valley and Bethune-Cookman that weren't explosive at all. They just weren't a good offensive team. They did score 24 points a game, which put them at third. But a lot of that was buoyed by early season performances. And the defense was more than capable. They also gave up 24 points per game. They finished ninth in total defense. Their rushing defense was solid at fourth. Their passing defense was not good at all. They were last, but I thought they had the Jimmies and Joes to kind of get to a solid record. I had them finishing like third in the division. They finished basically tied for last. The only reason they're fifth and not 60 because they beat Pine Bluff. I think the offensive deficiencies is the reason why this team did not move any further than where they were. Because when you're that dependent on turnovers, especially short fields and stuff, that's not always going to be sustainable. And I think that's what kind of caught up to them. Even when they had games where they started to force turnovers, and even like Alabama in them game where they scored a touchdown on defense, the offense did nothing in the second half. And so that's the main reason why I have him there. I don't even have it. I don't even have that as a slight on him. I do have him hiring the guy he hired as the slight on him, but I don't have a lot of the other stuff in season on him. I do think he's a great recruiter. I don't think he's gonna be a D coach next season. I'm gonna go ahead and say that now. I don't know where they're gonna finish, but he will not be a D coach next season. If he is, that's something horribly wrong. Because I do think he's gonna, he's recruiting well. He's gonna recruit well, and he'll get that offense on track. And I think they'll be a lot better than where they were. The last tier is the F tier, and these three guys are on the F tier because basically they got fired. Now they would have been in different. I think they would have been in different tiers if they didn't get fired. Coach Wade from Valley really was the surprising one to me. I would say, I don't know. I guess I can say for me, he would probably be the most surprising one. I mean, not because of his record, because he was 1-11 and 1-7, and they didn't look good at all until late in the season when they started to kind of find their way a little bit, and they upset FAMU, and they looked like they were kind of gonna, turn the corner at a high-scoring shootout against Alabama and then to close out the season. They seemed like they would be, moving in the right direction. They weren't great offensively, defensively. They were typical Valley team, kind of in the middle of everything. They had a great guy, Nathan Remember, their wide receiver. But that didn't work out for them, and Coach Wade was gone. So that's why I put that. He probably would have still finished in the F tier because Valley just was not good this year. But getting fired, I think, automatically puts you there. So he probably was the only guy who would have been there regardless of whether he got fired or not. Coach McDowell, he I would say, if I would say a team that was the most disappointing to me this season, it would be Prairie View. Not because I had outrageous expectations for them, because I thought they would be second or third, but I think they just never really got it going. I think that loss to Texas Southern early kind of hurt them mentally. They did bounce back and beat Northwestern State in a game that was way closer than it probably should have been. And then they lost to Michigan State, which was expected. And then they lost to Southern in a game they had a 2-score lead and ended up losing overtime. And so going into the Grambling game, you're sitting at 0-2 with your season basically hanging in the balance. You pulled out an overtime victory over Grambling to kind of right the ship a little bit. Um, I thought they looked solid against Incarnate Word early, but they got pulled away from, and then they lost to Pine Bluff, which is where I kind of think things kind of got a little rocky there. And I think now you're 1-3 in conference, and the door is closing rapidly. They did beat Texas A&M Commerce and Valley and FAMU, which gave them a 3-game winning streak. But by that point, the division was kind of already getting wrapped up. So they kind of made things a little bit better. But then you closed out with a loss to Alcorn and then an ugly loss to Bama State 9-6. And this team just never really, they just never really found themselves. Um, they were just all over the place. Um, they didn't, they play, for various reasons. They played multiple quarterbacks, finished fifth in passing. The passing defense was ninth. The rushing attack, which I thought with some of the guys they had would be better, but they finished ninth in rushing. Their rush defense was actually third. The total defense finished seventh, and their total offense was seventh as well. They finished ninth in scoring offense, and they were sixth in scoring defense. So, like I said, they were all over the place. They just and a lot of time when you would listen to press conferences and things, you would hear a lot of, we had to get the guys right. The coaches had to make this change, had to do this, had to do that. Not necessarily adjustments that you want to hear, but they just never seemed like they were dialed in the right way. And, their expectations of that program is different than most of ours. But so they felt like, this season was not acceptable. And so I think with the season they had, he stayed. Though the ending stretch probably would keep them between a C and a D, but like I say, getting fired is automatic F to me, so that's why he's there. And last but not least is Coach Maynard from Alabama A&M. 4-4 in conference, 6-6 overall. Got fired. I thought he would at least hang on for another year. This was a team with a very good offense and a defense that was not good. Second in scoring offense, and 10th in, ninth in scoring defense. Total offense, again, they were first in the league there. They finished eighth in total defense. They were third in rushing offense. They were sixth in rushing defense. They were first in passing offense, and they were 11th in passing defense. So as you can see, the offense was very good. Even playing multiple quarterbacks, the offense was very good. Defensively, they just weren't really able to get the stops they needed and make the plays. And they were again the definition of an average team: 6-6, 4-4. That's completely average. Probably would have finished in the C tier if he kept his job, but like I said, they finished ultimately finished firing him. So that's why they got in the F tier. Season started off like you would expect, losing to Auburn. They beat Kentucky State and Georgetown, Kentucky, and they lost to Austin Peay. So they're sitting at 2-2 going to conference play. Fell behind big to Jackson State, but made a run at the game, lost by 7. Blew out Bethune-Cookman. So you had 3-3, again, average. Beating the teams that you were supposed to beat, basically losing to everybody that you were supposed to lose to. Then you lose to Alabama State and Southern in back-to-back weeks. Them didn't lose to anybody that finished behind them. They just won the games that they were supposed to. They lost the games, I guess you could say they were supposed to. Uh, they typically had pretty high scores, but their losses, they didn't really score much. The defense gave up points in a lot of games, but in other games they were at least scoring wise solid. and I thought that would be enough to get them over the hump, but that wasn't enough, and they ended up dropping their coach. So that's why they finished in the F tier. So that's pretty much our coaching tier list, coaching grade list, however you want to put it. We'll be back tomorrow with SWAC Smoke live, 7 p.m., 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern. And we'll continue our season recaps probably on Sunday. Basketball preview coming at some point. And probably got a lot of stuff coming next week with the Christmas holiday. Got some free time, probably have a lot of stuff going on. So y'all keep it locked here. And we will catch y'all on the rebound. Peace.